domain is going to be important for the rest of the semester. And so here, the domain, again, is the largest set of real numbers for which the value of f of x is a real number. The domain is all the x values that are being used as part of the graph. The range is all the y values that are being used as part of the graph. And an open circle means that the x value is not part of the graph, and a closed circle means that it is part of the graph. So basically, what you want to think about is the domain is all the x's being used to make this graph. And then the range is all the y values that are being used to make up the graph. And another important thing is, if you have an open circle, we're going to use parentheses when we write domain. If you have a closed circle, we're going to use brackets. And so here, let's put arrows here to make sure this graph is continuing. And if we want to find the domain, we want to look at what are the x-axis, what are the x values that are being used. So for example, this x value, if I go up, I will find it on the graph. This x value, if I go up, it will be in this part of the graph. This one would be on part of the graph. If I use -6 and come down, it's going to be on the graph. So basically for domain, we're using all of these values for x. And so this is going to go on forever. So we say that the domain is -infinity to +infinity. You always want to write the smallest number first. Now for the range, it's all the y values. So you want to look at the y-axis. So if I pick this point here on the y-axis, notice that it is going to land on the graph. So no matter which one I pick, it's going to land. So for the range, you're looking at all the y-axis values that are being used. And in this case, it's -infinity to +infinity. So let's look at the next one, domain. What x values are being used? So again, if we look at all these x values, these are all being used. Number 2, if I go down, I never touch the graph. If I go up, I never touch the graph. So we can see that this graph is going from 1 and it's ending at -3. So again, you want to use the smallest value, in this case, -3. It has an open circle, that means we're going to use a parentheses. And then 1 is a closed circle, so we're going to use a bracket. And then the range, we look at the smallest y value being used. -5, if I go across, I'm never going to touch the graph. But -4, notice that it touches the graph. It's a closed circle, so we use a bracket. And then the highest value is going to be 0. And although 0 is not included here, it is included over here. So we use a bracket. You're not always going to have a graph, so we need to find the domain algebraically. And so there's really 3 things to ask yourself. Does the equation have a fraction? Does the equation have a square root? And does it have a logarithm? If your answer to these 3 questions is no, then the domain is always -infinity to +infinity. If the answer to these 3 questions is yes, that means that there's some restrictions or some values that we have to remove from our domain. So the first one, find the domain of the function f of x equals x plus 3 and write in interval notation. So the first question is, do you see any fractions here? The answer is no. Do you see any square roots? The answer is no. Do you see anything with the word log in here, logarithms? The answer is no. Therefore, my domain will be -infinity to +infinity. You can also think about the graph. This graph is a line. And so if you notice, it's going to use all the x values. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. X squared minus 7x. Do you have a fraction? No. Do you have a square root? No. It has a square, but not a square root. Remember, the square root would be using this symbol. So no fraction, no square root, and no logarithms. So the domain, negative infinity to positive infinity. This graph is a parabola. And so a parabola uses all the x values here. Then the next one, find the domain. Do we have a fraction? Yes, we have a fraction. So what that means is that there's some restrictions. Okay, so I'm going to say here, there is a fraction. So some restrictions will apply. So to find those restrictions, the first thing we want to do is set the denominator equal to 0. So basically the restriction, if you have a fraction, is any number that gives you a 0 here. Why? Because we cannot divide by 0. So the denominator here is x, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. And so this answer that you get is not included in the domain. So if I had a number line here, then we can use everything except for 0. So the way we write our domain is it's going to go from negative infinity, because I'm using all of these values, but then I'm going to get to 0. And I don't want to use 0, so I use this symbol. And then I'm going to continue with 0, and then I'm going to go all the way over here, so that's positive. To include both of these, we use a symbol U, which stands for union. And so my domain is going to be this right here. The next one, do I have a fraction? Yes. So automatically there's a restriction. So to find the restriction, remember we set the denominator equal to 0. My denominator is x plus 2. And then we solve for x, or for the variable. So x would be negative 2. So this would be not included in domain. So my domain will go from negative infinity all the way to negative 2. And then it's going to start at negative 2 and go to infinity. And we use the union sign to say it's both of these that make up the domain. And if you're looking at a number line, we're using everything here, but we're not using this negative 2. Okay, the next one, 11, find the domain of the function square root of x plus 3 and write in interval notation. Do we have a fraction? No. Do we have a square root? Yes. So there is some restrictions. So the restriction comes with numbers that will give you a negative in the square root, since we cannot take the square root of a negative number. So to find those restrictions, we set the radicate, which is the stuff inside the square root, to greater than or equal to 0. So my radicand here is x plus 3. I'm going to set it greater than or equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve for x. So x is greater than or equal to negative 3. So I basically subtracted 3 on both sides. Unlike the other ones that was not included in the domain, the answer you get here, this is where the domain starts. Okay, so when we write the domain, we start with this number. Since I have an equal sign, I'm going to use a bracket. So I'm going to go from negative 3 to positive infinity. So if you're looking at a number line, here is negative 3. And so we're starting here, going all the way over here. And then the last one, find the domain. So do we have a fraction? Yes. So we set the denominator equal to 0. Solve for x. So we say that 7 and negative 7 is not included in domain. So fractions, the answer you get is not included. Square roots, the answer you get is where you begin. So here I have this number line. So we're saying that we can use everything except for 7 and -7. So we can use all of these values. So my domain would be negative infinity. But when we get to -7, we cannot use it. So I'm going to have -7 here with a parentheses, union. Then I'm going to start at -7 again. And I'm going to use all of these numbers up to the number 7. Union. But then I start at 7 again. Remember, 7 is not used. That's why we use a parentheses. And then you start from 8 to, from 7 to infinity. So throughout the semester, we'll be